At first glance, Level 5 transporter accident looks like the kind of Star Trek episode that exists purely because somebody in the writer's room asked, what if the entire Enterprise crew became puppets? And honestly, that is exactly what makes this episode so dangerous to underestimate. Because beneath the ridiculous visuals, the pirate attack, the Vulcan robes, and one of the strangest transporter malfunctions we have ever seen, this episode is actually doing something very deliberate with Spock. So before we get into all the details, here's the quick recap. The Enterprise is traveling through Rhizonian space toward Vulcan when Scotty attempts to push transporter technology beyond its established limits. The experiment goes spectacularly wrong, leaving most of the crew transformed into puppets, while Spock remains functional enough to understand what is happening. Then, while the crew is helpless, Orion pirates seize the Enterprise. What follows is basically a rescue mission where Spock has to save the ship, confront his own emotions, and somehow deal with the fact that his friends now look like something that escaped from a children's television show. And yes, this is completely insane, but it is also very, very Star Trek. The episode takes place at Stardate 3019.4, with the Enterprise patrolling Rhizonian space on its way to Vulcan. Rhizonian space itself is a new bit of Trek geography, but the idea of piracy certainly isn't new to the franchise. We have seen Orions, Ferengi, Breen, and other factions engage in piracy or privateering across different eras, so the Orion interceptors appearing here aren't completely random. They fit into a much older Star Trek tradition of the Federation occasionally running into people who look at a starship and think that would make a very expensive prize. But the real story begins with Scotty and Spock discussing transporter range. Scotty manages to achieve a transport over 27,000 kilometers, which Spock points out is roughly 2,000 kilometers farther than anything they have previously accomplished. And this is one of those little details that sounds impressive until you remember just how enormous space is. In fact, by later 24th century standards, Galaxy-class transporters could theoretically operate over much greater distances. So 27,000 kilometers sounds less like an enormous leap and more like Star Trek temporarily forgetting that Earth itself has a geosynchronous orbit at roughly 35,786 kilometers. But there is a bigger reason this scene matters. Scotty's obsession with extending transporter range is actually a neat callback to the 2009 Star Trek film, where the Kelvin timeline version of Scotty is working on transwarp transportation capable of moving people across extraordinary distances. Prime Spock even helps him by providing equations his counterpart had already solved. So this isn't simply Scotty being the crazy engineer who wants to make the transporter go farther. It's part of a long-running idea that Scotty is constantly pushing transportation technology towards something that should, by all reasonable standards, be impossible. And this time, he pushes too far. The title itself is also worth examining. In The Next Generation, diagnostic levels generally worked in the opposite direction. A lower number represented a more serious or intensive diagnostic procedure. But later Star Trek has occasionally used higher numbers to indicate greater levels. So Level 5 here isn't necessarily contradicting one single universal Star Trek rule. It reflects the fact that the franchise has never been completely consistent about how these classifications work. And that inconsistency is honestly very Star Trek. Then the transporter accident happens, and suddenly the episode becomes something completely different. The crew are transformed into puppets. Now, this isn't technically the first time Star Trek has done this. Lower Decks already turned Kayshon into a puppet-like object in Kayshon, His Eyes Open. And outside Star Trek, the idea has been used famously in Angel's Smile Time, as well as being parodied in Stargate SG-1 and Community. But Strange New Worlds does something clever with the concept. It doesn't treat the puppets merely as a joke. It uses them to strip the Enterprise crew of everything that normally gives them power. Their uniforms don't matter anymore. Their rank doesn't matter. Their physical strength doesn't matter. Their ability to operate consoles doesn't matter. They are reduced to helpless versions of themselves. And then the pirates arrive. That timing is important because suddenly the ridiculous transporter accident becomes a genuine tactical crisis. The Enterprise has effectively been turned into a sitting duck. The crew can't properly operate the ship, the doors become a problem, and Spock is forced to function as one of the only people capable of doing anything about the situation. And this is where the episode starts becoming a Spock story rather than a puppet comedy. While trying to maintain his composure, Spock uses the Vulcan mantra, "Logic is the rhythm of your katra." The katra, of course, is essentially the Vulcan concept of a person's spiritual essence or consciousness, famously explored in The Search for Spock. But Spock begins hearing echoes from the earlier Season 4 episode, The Griffin Incident. That is significant because this isn't just a random callback. The episode is deliberately connecting Spock's present emotional state to things that have already happened to him this season. The more he tries to suppress everything and rely on logic, the more those memories and emotions begin pushing their way back into his consciousness. And then there is T'Pring. When she encounters the situation, her suspicion that the Enterprise is involved in some kind of hijinks is actually hilarious when you remember her history with the ship. She has already experienced Spock's body swap disaster in Spock Amok, and she has dealt with him being physically transformed into a human in charades. So, from T'Pring's perspective, seeing another bizarre situation involving Spock and the Enterprise probably isn't even surprising anymore. It is basically becoming a pattern. And when Spock eventually sees the puppet version of T'Pring, the soundtrack deliberately echoes the music from Amok Time, the classic TOS episode that introduced T'Pring and established one of the most important relationships in Spock's life. That musical callback is doing more than making longtime fans smile. It reminds us that beneath all the comedy, Spock's relationship with T'Pring is still central to his emotional development. Then comes one of the most visually ridiculous sequences in the entire episode. Pike, La'an, and Una, disguised in Vulcan robes, effectively stacked together in the classic totem pole disguise. It is absurd, but that's precisely the point. Strange New World has always been willing to embrace the theatrical side of Star Trek. It doesn't always want to make everything gritty or serious. Sometimes the Enterprise crew genuinely has to hide 3 people inside one ridiculous costume because apparently that is the best plan available. And somehow it works. Meanwhile, there is another fantastic little Easter egg when T'Pring rescues Spock, and we can see a bottle resembling Romulan ale behind the counter. The liquid doesn't appear to have the familiar blue color, which is exactly the kind of tiny production detail that Star Trek fans will freeze frame for 10 minutes. But the biggest thematic moment comes when Spock and Pike are separated by glass. Spock touches Pike's hand through the barrier, and Pike invokes the famous phrase, "the needs of the many." Immediately, longtime fans will recognize the emotional echo of the Wrath of Khan. The complete Vulcan aphorism is, "the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one." But Star Trek has always complicated that idea. Spock ultimately sacrifices himself for the many in the Wrath of Khan. Then Kirk essentially reverses the equation in The Search for Spock, risking his ship, career, and everything else because saving Spock matters more to him than following the cold calculation of what benefits the majority. And that contradiction is exactly what makes Spock's story here so interesting. Spock is constantly being taught that logic should allow him to separate himself from emotional attachment. But the episode keeps forcing him into situations where that separation becomes impossible. There is even a hilarious mystery in the middle of the episode. How exactly did Pike get back into the ship and into that room when everyone else couldn't operate the doors? At first, it looks like one of those classic don't think about it too hard Star Trek moments. But the episode eventually answers the question. And that is important because it shows that the apparent plot holes are actually part of the mystery being constructed around the transporter accident. Then La'an enters the equation. Her storyline connects back to 4.5 Vulcans, where she has already been worried about her Augment heritage becoming more prominent. The episode doesn't simply forget about that anxiety. Instead, it continues using these bizarre situations to test how the characters see themselves. That's really the secret sauce of this episode. Every ridiculous science fiction gimmick is secretly an excuse to remove the characters from their normal identities. Spock loses control of his environment. La'an confronts the possibility that something inside her is changing. Pike is physically separated from his crew. T'Pring is forced to navigate another completely absurd Enterprise situation. And the crew itself becomes literally powerless. Then there is the Orion pirate invasion. The Orion interceptors have been part of Star Trek lore since Enterprise's Borderland, and their appearance here reinforces that this isn't just some random new enemy. The Orion civilization has always had complicated gender and social dynamics, and the episode plays with the familiar stereotype of Orion women controlling men through pheromones. That matters because Star Trek has spent decades slowly expanding the reality behind the old Orion slave girl stereotype. The franchise established an Enterprise that Orion women could use pheromones to influence males, revealing that the supposed image of Orion women being submissive was actually a massive misunderstanding of their society. So even when Strange New Worlds is being ridiculous, it is still pulling from decades of Trek world building. And finally, we reach the strangest part of the entire story. The episode eventually reveals that much of what Spock experiences isn't quite what it initially appears to be. The whole situation begins taking on the feeling of an all-just-a-dream story. And Star Trek has done this before, sometimes brilliantly. Deep Space Nine's Far Beyond the Stars used an altered reality to force Sisko into confronting something deeply personal. Here, the concept is applied to Spock, and the result is much lighter on the surface, but surprisingly meaningful underneath. Because even if the experience wasn't literally happening in the way Spock believed, it still affects him. And that's the point. The episode isn't really asking whether Spock can survive being surrounded by puppet versions of his friends. It's asking whether Spock can continue pretending that logic means being emotionally untouched. He can't. The final piece of that puzzle comes with the famous mind meld phrase, "My mind to your mind, my thoughts to your thoughts." Interestingly, that exact phrase wasn't actually used in the original live-action TOS. It debuted in the animated series, spoken by Spock's giant clone in the Infinite Vulcan. So even one of the episode's most recognizable Vulcan phrases is another example of Strange New Worlds playing with the entire history of Star Trek rather than only the original series. And that's why Level 5 transporter accident works better than its ridiculous premise suggests. Yes, it is a puppet episode. Yes, there are pirates. Yes, there are disguises, transporter accidents, bizarre Vulcan rituals, Romulan AL Easter eggs, and enough callbacks to make longtime fans pause the screen every 30 seconds. But underneath all of that is a very simple story about Spock. He is trying to maintain control of himself in a universe that keeps giving him reasons not to. And perhaps the most Star Trek thing about the whole episode is that the solution isn't simply to become more logical. It is to understand that emotion and logic don't necessarily have to be enemies. Spock doesn't become weaker because he cares. He becomes stronger because he finally understands what that caring actually means. So yes, the Enterprise crew becoming puppets is ridiculous. But sometimes Star Trek hides its most interesting character work inside the most ridiculous premise imaginable. And honestly, if this franchise has taught us anything after 60 years, it's that the strangest missions are often the ones that reveal the most about the people aboard the Enterprise.